I'd heard stories about this incredible river. The fishing was just supposed to be amazing. It was this Shangri-La, this holy grail sort of fishery. And all the fish were supposed to be big too. So I got super excited. I even got one of the people who knew about this river to tell me where to go, tell me how to fish it. So I loaded the truck up and I headed off to the river to go have a bunch of fun. But when I got there, I felt as lost and betrayed and as scared as when you pick up a cookie off of the plate, take a bite out of it, and realize that those weren't chocolate chips, those were raisins. Now, I was intimidated by this water because it was unlike anything that I'd ever fished before. If that's ever happened to you, then you need to keep listening to today's show so that you can learn how to approach any new water with confidence. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled. I'm your host, Spencer Durrant. Excited to be here, as always, to talk shop, talk fly fishing with everybody. This is a fun thing that we get to do, and I'm enjoying this a lot. I'll be completely honest. It's a lot more fun than I anticipated. And, that might sound a little negative, but you never know what to expect when you start a new project. You never know what to expect with a new podcast like this. And I've had a ton of fun doing it. So I hope everybody else listening is having fun listening to it as well. And speaking of listening, we've got a pretty interesting lineup today talking about nets, how to fish runs, what to do when you run into rivers with really low fish populations, and then some advice on teaching yourself to fly fish. So we've got more than a few different topics to get to. I think it should make for a pretty interesting show. But before we jump into the questions, I got a question for you, the listener slash viewer of this podcast. You ever taken somebody new fly fishing and just felt like you were literally Google? You're standing there in the water with them, and they pa- just pound you with questions all day. What's this do? Why do I need that? Why are you using those for that? It starts to wear on you a little bit sometimes because, yes, you do want to get your buddy into some fish. That's why you took them fishing with you. But, at the same time, you want to get into fish yourself, right? I mean, it's fishing time and we never have enough of it. So if you feel like your buddy has a ton of questions that could be answered, have you, and here's the question, have you told your buddy to, hey, send those questions on into Untangled? They'll answer them. That's what Untangled's here for. We're here to help answer all these questions from beginner stuff up to intermediate expert type stuff. We'll answer it all. So if you've got questions, or if your fishing buddy's got questions, and you're just looking for a little bit more quiet time on the water, please don't hesitate to send those questions in to us. There's always a link in the podcast description to send questions. You can get to us via email, via carrier pigeon, via the Pony Express, and it's been windy enough lately here in Wyoming where I live that smoke signals are reaching me from as far away as New Mexico and Canada. So send them on in, folks. We'll get your questions answered. Remember, that's what Untangled is here for. And one last thing, if I may, wherever you're listening to this show, if you could please rate the show and subscribe to it on whatever platform, that would be wonderful. It makes a bigger difference than you know. The more subscribers and followers, it helps us, it helps keeps the lights on here. Electricity ain't cheap these days. Like eggs, you got to take out a mortgage just about to pay for it. It's getting ridiculous. But anyways, that's depressing stuff, and we don't want to talk about that. We want to talk about fishing. We want to talk about fun, enjoyable stuff. So with that, grab your blanket, grab your binkies, and settle in for story time with Spencer. Alrighty, folks, grab your Diet Coke, settle in, get ready, because we got a good story time for you this week. At least I think it's good story time. So hopefully you do too. Oh, so this story I'm gonna tell you it's about fishing for trout with mouse flies, but it's not the conventional mouse fly fishing story that you think of because when we talk about fishing with mouse flies, we automatically think of, at least I'm assuming most of us think of fishing at night and fishing all night long. And you got your headlamps and you're throwing flies and you maybe only catch one fish, but it's like a 30-inch brown trout. I actually have a couple of buddies of mine who are very uh, avid night fishers. Brian Allison and Chris Cutler. They're two incredible anglers, better than I can be, and they just go ham. I can't keep up with them. I tried once, and it was kind of funny because we were up there. Brian lives up in Montana, so me and Chris went up to see him, and I was I was excited. This is the first time that I'd ever fished with mouse flies at night. So I didn't know what to expect though. And we get up there and we start at like 9 o'clock at night. It's pitch dark and we start fishing. And about 2, 3 in the morning rolls around and I curled up on the boat and went to sleep because I was so exhausted. And Brian and Chris just kept fishing until the sun came up. They just went hard. They did that for I think we were there for 3 days. They did that 3 nights in a row. And I couldn't keep up. It was kind of embarrassing. So that's like the real mousing, and the stuff that they do up in Alaska. I mean, that's just ridiculous. But it's Alaska. That's just kind of what you would expect being up in a place like that. But the mousing that I want to talk about today, I was with a buddy of mine. His name's also Brian, different Brian, and he and I were in a pretty remote part of eastern Utah, out in the desert. And Brian had told me about this little stream, maybe 2, 3 feet wide at the widest point, really tiny, tiny water, but there were a bunch of cutthroat in it. And he also told me he was catching these cutthroat on mouse flies in the middle of the day. Yeah, that was my reaction too. I looked at him. I was like, "What are you talking about? Fish don't eat mouse flies in the middle of the day, you idiot." Well, it turns out I was the idiot because they do. We go down to this little stream. It's about October. It was cold. It was right before hunting season opened up. Brian and I hunt together quite often. So it was right before hunting season opened up, and we were done with all of our scouting for our elk. So we were down there fishing, and sure enough, we just got this little Moorish mouse, maybe I think like size 10, not a very big mouse, all things considered. Threw it up onto this little creek. And again, if you're watching the podcast, I'm holding my hands apart. It was maybe, okay, that might be a little bit more than 3 feet. I'm not great at estimating length. I'm a fly fisherman, okay? But it was about yay wide. So I threw cast up in there, started stripping the mouse back to me the way that you fish mouse flies. You try to make it look like a mouse actually struggling on the surface. And craziest thing happened. Fish came up and ate it. Right, it was like 10:30 in the morning, maybe a little later. It was a long drive to get in there, but it was early in the morning. Sun's in the sky. Fish are eating mouse flies off the top, and we caught fish all day doing that. We got to some of the bigger pools on the river, and we got into some pretty big fish. I think the big fish that day was probably 16 inches. It wasn't super big, but for water that's, yay wide, that's a pretty good fish. It was just really fun to fish all day with mouse flies like that because that's not an experience that you typically get to have, right? It's not something that we think of as our typical mouse fishing excursion. But I what I liked about that and why I wanted to share the story is it reminded me when Brian and I went to do that, it's worth trying to experiment and try to shake things up every now and then because that's how you learn that there's some cool things going on. That's how you learn a new technique or even discover a new technique or catch that really big fish out of the creek. You do it by kind of experimenting sometimes, throwing stuff against the wall to see what sticks. I mean, that's all that all the fishing techniques that we have now. they were developed with a little bit more refinement than throwing it at the wall to see what sticks. But it's that same concept where they're like, hey, we're going to try this. We are going to try fishing this dry fly this way and see what happens. The first person that fished a mouse was probably like, hey, you know what? I'm going to do this. Who knows if it's going to work? But we know bass eat off top water, and we know trout eat bugs off the top, so it would stand to reason that maybe they'll eat a mouse. It's there's a lot of experimentation still that you can do in fly fishing, so it's worth doing that. And it's worth remembering little stories like this. And it was really it was an all day adventure with Brian and those cutthroat on mice. We caught them on mice until we left. So it, it really was just a singularly unique experience. I had a ton of fun with it. But that's the story. Remember, don't get stuck in a rut. Experiment, try some fun stuff, and have some fun. And with that, folks, we are going to jump right on into the questions. We'll start the show today with two short questions. We got these in, and just a reminder, if you're new here, I do like to answer a couple shorter questions to start the show off when we get them. These are questions that may not necessarily need a longer answer. They're just short, right? They're kind of short and to the point. So this is what I mean when I tell you all that there is no question that's too short or too beginner level for Untangled, because we'll answer them here. This is a great forum to do that. So the first of these comes to us. Andrew from Canada writes in and asks, can you please tell what you use to eliminate the FBS, flying blood suckers? Thanks for all the great info. Well, Andrew, it's kind of funny. I would think that somebody from Canada would know the answer to that, right? Because y'all deal with the mosquitoes worse than us, from what I understand. Uh, it's also funny that this came in now, because we were just talking about mosquito bites here in the office, me and Alex in Berkeley, because we just got done filming some stuff, and Alex had mosquito bites on the palms of his hands, which I thought was really weird. I've never gotten them there. Alex hasn't either. It was really interesting. So, uh, anyways, funny little anecdote for you. Honestly, the answer here: long sleeve shirts and bug spray. That's about it. The bugs are just going to be part of the experience, and as much as I'd love to be able to get rid of them all the time, it's just not going to happen. I don't think. So, good question though. And if anybody's got some tips, let us know. I would love if you've got like a tried and true getting rid of mosquito tip, then you need to let us know, because that's information that we need to share with everybody. Oh, thanks, Andrew. Appreciate your question. And our last short question for the day, David from California writes in and asks, there are all kinds of fishing nets out there. I have an old one about 20 years old. What would you recommend? Well, David, anything with a rubber basket. The material that the net, handle, and hoop are made out of, that doesn't matter. The basket material matters, because those old cloth nets, and I'm sure we've all seen them, it's the prototypical net that you think of when you think of netting fish. Uh, those cloth nets actually, when they touch a trout, and I think it happens with other fish species as well. I'm not 100% sure. I know it's definitely a thing on trout, though. When that cloth touches a trout, that cloth actually removes that slime layer. And that slime layer is really important, right? Because it helps the fish stay healthy. It protects them from all sorts of disease. It protects them from Aunt Karen's rhubarb pie at Thanksgiving dinner. Whatever it is, your mother in law's cooking, that you have to grin and say, oh, yeah, that was great. Thanks. It protects them from all of that stuff. But and that's why you always get your hands wet before you touch a trout, so that you don't remove that slime layer. It's really important to not ever remove that. But the rubber nets, the nets with a rubber basket, those don't remove it. So that's what I would recommend. And I really like a net with a deep basket and like a medium length handle, so around 15 to 18 inches long. That's pretty ideal for most of the trout fishing that I do. So hopefully that's helpful for you, David. Appreciate the question. And let's jump into the main part of our show. Blake from Utah writes in, says, "Hey Spencer, first off, love the podcast and your extensive knowledge. I've recently gotten out onto the rivers, and say I get to a spot where I'm ready to wet a line and I find a juicy hole. What's the best way to break that run apart? Do I divide that run into thirds and fish the bottom third, middle third, and then the top third? Just looking for some insight on how to break down a run I'm looking to fish. Any insight would be appreciated. Tight lines, brother." Blake, thank you for sending that in, and really stoked that you enjoy the podcast. Thank you for that too. This is a really good question, and it's a question that we hear a lot from beginners, and it's a question I had myself as a beginner. You get to the river and you're like, okay, well, where do I go to fish? What do I do? And this is what I was alluding to in the hook of today's episode. You get to the river and it's water that you're unfamiliar with. How in the heck do you go about actually fishing it so that you can be confident when you get to any water? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. And just as an aside here, we do have a huge portion of our new beginner fly fishing masterclass dedicated to water types, and in particular, this type of water, the runs that you just mentioned. You definitely want to head over to YouTube, subscribe to us there if you aren't already, so that you don't miss it when that episode drops. That particular episode of the Fly Fishing Masterclass isn't out yet, but it will be coming out soon. Stay tuned for it. I put a link to that masterclass in the podcast description so that you can make sure you're subscribed and you don't miss it. Now, as for your question, you mentioned a run, and that's a specific type of water. So for those who don't know, I want to get everybody on the same playing field here. So I'm going to define runs for a second. Runs are, they're kind of like the connecting water between all other water types. They're what holds everything together. It's like it's like if you've ever seen The Big Lebowski, it's like the rug in the dude's room, man. It just ties the room together. Runs are deeper than a riffle, but they're not so deep that they become a pool. The water's moving pretty quickly through a run. It's not still and slow like it is within a pool, but runs are deeper than a riffle. And since they're deeper than a riffle, they don't have the same surface disturbance that you see in a riffle. That classic choppy water surface that defines a riffle. It's very emblematic of fly fishing. You see that, and you know that the fish are going to be hanging out in those riffles. And riffles are also great because since they're shallower, it's a lot easier to see some of the seams and the transitions where the fish are going to hang out. It's and by the way, the seams and transitions, trout love those. They love any kind of place where two different things merge, like shallow and deep water or fast and slow water. That's what a seam is, by the way. It's the line of water. It's the line, pardon me, where water of two different speeds meets. It's a great place to target for trout because they can hang out in that seam and collect all the food coming out of the faster water into the slower water. They don't have to spend as much energy. So that's why it's a great place for them to hang out. It's like me at an all-you-can-eat wing place, right? I just have to keep telling the server, hey, yeah, more this way, all right? And everybody's looking at you and judging you, and you just look at them and say, hey, you don't get a body like this unless you are willing to put in the work for it. All right. Wings and Mountain Dew. Oh, anyways, back to runs. Since runs are deeper than riffles, it can be harder to decode where the obstacles are in the river. And those obstacles, like rocks and logs, those create small pockets of holding water. Those also create the seams. You can see that pretty easy in a riffle, again, because that water's shallow. Imagine you're standing at the bottom of a riffle, you're looking up, and there's some rocks poking up, and you can see the pockets behind the rocks, or there's a log that sits in and creates a seam. You can see the seam where the water's moving quick and then slow, and you can see that line. There's foam lines. There's a lot of easy to see information on the surface of a riffle that you lose in a run because those runs are deeper. So it's best to actually do what you said, Blake, and break that run. Yes, Blake, I'm making sure I got your name right. I'm so sorry. But it's actually good to do what you said, Blake, and break that run into multiple sections and thoroughly fish each part of it. Some people like to visualize a grid and fish runs with like that grid system where they put their flies into every square of their grid. My brain doesn't really work that way. So, and my mother in law would probably say my brain doesn't work at all. Uh, but what I choose to do is I like to start off by covering the water near to far, and then I cover the entire run top to bottom, and then I cover the entire depth of the run as well. I'm going to explain what I mean with those three things. So, first off, I said you cover the water near to far. You want to always work, no matter what type of water you're fishing. You want to always work near to far with your casts because you don't want to spook the fish that are closest to you in the run, in the riffle, in the pool. Again, in this case, we're talking about runs. So you do not want to spook those fish that are closest to you. If you cast your line over them or you wade too close to them, you're going to spook those fish, which in turn could spook the rest of the run. And then the next thing you know, you're not catching any fish and you're really upset and you stomp off to the truck like a 2-year-old. Not that I've ever done that. So fish the water that's closest to you first and then gradually work out further and further as you thoroughly fish that stuff in front of you. Now, my second point, I said cover the entire run top to bottom. Make sure you do this. Don't leave any piece of that water unfished. What you're going to find in a run as you fish through it is it's going to feel like the fish are scattered randomly. Like they're just thrown in there. Like a 2-year-old is just like, oh, fish here, fish here, fish here. And, you know, just there's no rhyme or reason to it. It feels that way again because it's tougher to see underneath in the run. You don't see where all the disturbances are. You usually can't see where all of the best holding water is. That's why it feels random. It's not, but it feels that way because we lack the visual clues on the surface that we're used to in other water types. So make sure you fish the entire run top to bottom so that you're not missing out on the opportunity to catch some fish. That leads us into the third point, which is cover the water in depth. That means just make sure that you're deep enough that you're covering the entire water column. If the run isn't too deep, you can probably just fish through the entire thing once with a dry dropper rig and you'll be set. That dry dropper rig it should be illegal. I think it's so effective. And it's the way that I fish probably 95% of the time. I've been fishing a lot more double nymphs under an indicator lately just because the water's been kind of weird. But a dry dropper covers you for so much of your fishing. It's a wonderful rig. But if you've gone through it with your dry dropper, you fish this run and you weren't grabbing bottom very often, or you don't feel like you caught very many fish and you think there's more fish in there, or you never grabbed bottom at all, then it's probably worth going through that with a double nymph rig or even a streamer to get down to the bottom to where all the fish are, especially if those fish aren't looking up. They don't want anything else. They want something right in front of them. It's worth trying to just cover the run in depth. That's how you thoroughly cover all of the water. So you can use all these tips. Now, this is an important part to remember. So maybe write this down, or I don't know, whatever the kids do these days to remember things. But you can use these tips to fish any new water confidently, even if it's water that you've never fished before. These tips, what's the word I'm looking for? It's always funny when the podcast guy's at a loss for words, right? These guidelines, there, there we go. That's the word. These guidelines translate from river to river, and it doesn't matter if you're on small water or really big water. You break it down into manageable chunks. You fish that stuff near to far. You cover the entirety of the run and the depth. You'll get into fish eventually. So, really good question, Blake. Thanks a bunch for sending that one on. Next question comes to us, John from the UK near the Scotland border. He was very specific about his location. Writes in and says, "Hi again. It is me, John, from across the pond with another question that relates to many anglers worldwide. How do you approach or deal with those barren or rather limited rivers slash streams where the trout or fish are in the smaller sizes as well as numbers? These may be small and insignificant fishes to most other anglers, of which I know and understand, but the mastery of catching these truly wild creatures is what drives me. Hence, just one of the reasons I ask is I have such streams and rivers on offer where I live, which are driving me mad at the moment trying to beat Mother Nature. I was so spoiled at a previous river where the trout and sea trout slash salmon were in good numbers, so now it is relearning the approach. Thanks again from the UK. Tight lines to all." John, this is a really good question. And the river that you're describing sounds an awful lot like one that I love to fish, one of my favorite little rivers. The difference, though, is that the fish in mine are actually pretty big, and I'm not bragging. It sounds like it, but I'm not. That you mentioned the fish in yours are pretty small. The fish in this river that I'm talking about are really large on average. The average size is probably close to 17, 18 inches. They're just enormous fish. But it's a really big, wide river, and it only has about 800 fish per mile. That probably sounds like a lot, but for the size of this river, it's really not very many. A lot of the other rivers around it have a few thousand fish per mile. So, relatively speaking, there's not very many fish. And again, it's some of the biggest water in all of Wyoming. So, it's very large. It's very, mm, it's just big water. It's hard for me to describe it without a visual. Think Snake River size. All right. It's very large water. So, with that in mind, what I've found on this river is twofold. The fish are really often going to be in the best water and they move around a ton. Some days they're in the holes, and other days they're either gone or they're just not eating whatever it is that I'm throwing. In fact, there was this awesome little run that I found. I used to live down in southwest Wyoming, and I'd go fish this river quite often because it was only a couple hours from me down there. And I'd get up there, and from about January to whenever runoff started, I would fish, and the fish were consistently in this little run, but it was a perfect run. It was a deep slot right in the middle of some riffles, so the fish could hang out in deeper water. They didn't have to spend as much energy, and they had seams on either side. There were some tires and boulders in the river, and yes, there were tires. It really kind of sad, but there was a lot of habitat. There were a lot of obstacles that created some pockets of slower moving water that the fish could just enjoy. And when I found this, and it was really an inconspicuous run because you could barely see the slower water of the run in between two sides of this riffle. It was kind of sandwiched almost like a hot dog in there. It was, lots of riffles and then a really skinny little run in this deep slot. And the fish were just stacked in there. And you could stand there and catch fish all day. Like I said, from about January until whenever runoff started and the water got high again. It kind of pushed the fish out of that and they'd scamper off. But I would fish that run all the time. I caught a 25-inch rainbow out of it one time. And I remember thinking, okay, I figured this river out. And then I moved on from that run to other runs, no fish. I was trying to explore. I was trying to challenge myself, like we do in this sport, no fish. So what I learned from that is that there was something about that run, and I think it was a combination of depth and water speed that was perfect. It was out of all the water available to those fish, it was the best. That's why they were there. So from that, what I would take is that you should focus on fishing the best water and very thoroughly fishing that water. Switch up your flies, change your depths, really focused on getting the best presentation possible, but also don't be afraid to try different spots. Before I found that little run that I was talking about, I fished all over this river, up and down and sideways and diagonal and exaggerating a little bit. But I did. I put in the work and it was a random chance thing that I found this little spot. But once I found it, then I started to be able to identify other runs just like that throughout the river, and the fish were in those. Again, there's not very many fish in that river, so they gravitated towards the best water. I'm not I'm not sure why they do that. I'm also not sure why they move around a lot. My guess would be that the fish in this river are following very high protein food sources around. On this river that I was talking about, there were a lot of big crawdads in there. Other people might call them crawfish or crayfish. We call them crawdads here. At least I do. I grew up calling them crawdads. So I don't know. Somebody's probably calling them something else. But I think the fish might follow those critters around to eat them. I have no idea. That's just a guess on my part, but it feels right to me. So that's why I think fish might move around in the river. And I'm sure flows and whatnot have something to do with it. But that's just a guess on my part. So hopefully, like I said, focus on the best water and don't be afraid to try different spots to see where they are that day. That would be how I would tackle a river that doesn't have very many fish in it. So thanks a bunch, John, for sending that question in. I really appreciate it. We are on the last question of the show. I know it goes by really quick, doesn't it? And I've toyed around with the idea of doing longer podcast episodes. I've thought about maybe adding more questions or adding more stories. I don't know. I'm always thinking of ways to try and add some more value to what you're getting from this show and ways to just keep it fresh and engaging. So if there's a particular format or length or anything that you would like, don't be afraid to leave a comment. Let us know. I'm always interested to hear feedback from folks who listen to the show so that we can continually improve and give you the best resource possible to become a better fly angler. Now, with that in mind, Colton from Idaho writes in and says, I just barely started taking a liking to fly fishing, been spin fishing for years, and want a new challenge. The only problem is I don't have anyone to help me out, and self teaching has proven to be difficult. Any tips for videos, websites, resources to help me on my way? Also, what flies and rigs are the most beginner friendly so I can catch a daggum fish? Love the podcast and look forward to hearing from you more in the future. Also, Coke Zero all the way. Well, Colton, you're wrong. All right, unless it's from the fountain. I went over that last week. Coke Zero, specifically Cherry Coke Zero from Maverick, is superior from the fountain than Diet Coke. Diet Coke out of the fountain is not good. I will be. I will admit that. And I also think the Mountain Dew from the fountain is just disappointing. It's just not as crisp. It's not as smooth as Mountain Dew from a can. The can is supreme. And I think Alex disagrees with me on that. And Berkeley, I mean, he loves his chocolate milk, so I don't know Berkeley's stance on that either. But Colton, you did have a great question here, so let's go ahead and dive into that. I was actually in kind of a similar boat to you while I was growing up. I spin fished a ton, and then I switched over to fly fishing exclusively kind of later in my high school career. So you're in the right place. You're among friends, folks who've been there. You need to make sure that you take a look at our blog and all the resources that we have here at VFC. We've got a ton of stuff to help you teach yourself and I will link that in the podcast description. So you can go check that out as well. And don't forget, we've got the beginning fly fishing masterclass as well. So subscribe to that on YouTube so that you don't miss a single episode. We'll be releasing the entire series over the next few months. So that will help you a bunch as you keep on in the process of learning. We really put, like I said when we announced it, we put 18 months into this thing. So this wasn't just me and Alex and Berkeley sitting around and like, hey, we're gonna do a series. We're gonna do a fly fishing series, and we'll do it in a week, and we'll just go out and shoot it, and it'll be great. Yeah, that's not how it happened. All right, there was a lot that went into it. So as far as your question about you just want to catch some fish, I'd recommend going to an nymph rig. I know some folks are going to disparage that and disagree with me, but I really do think that nymphs, especially couple nymphs under an indicator, is probably the easiest for beginners to get used to. What does it feel like to set the hook on a fly? How do I deal with the line? What do I do with mending? It's not as visual as dry fly fishing. I don't enjoy nymphing as much as I enjoy dry fly fishing. I'm always really open about that. But I think it's just, I, I think it's a more condensed version when you go with nymphing. I think it's a condensed version of everything that you need to know. And once you've got a handle on it, it's a lot easier to then branch out and learn the dry fly fishing or the streamer fishing. Nymphing's a great way to learn the basics. That's why I recommend it. Unless, of course, you're in a place where the fish are just rising everywhere, then you want to tie a dry fly on. But a Frenchie and a zebra midge under an indicator, that should get the job done for you just about anywhere in Idaho. Just not the Henry's Fork, because, and I'll go on record as saying this, the Henry's Fork is criminally overrated. I mean, it's a good fishery, but it's not that good. I've had my butt kicked on the Henrys more than once, so there's a little bit of bad blood between me and the Henry. But I'll go on record as saying that it's good, but it ain't that great. I would if I could only fish the South Fork or the Henrys, South Fork of the Snake or the Henrys, I'd probably pick South Fork 10 times out of 10, to be honest with you. But that's just me. Anyways, don't forget, Colton, last thing. Part of the fun is learning along the way. So don't get so focused on, I just got to catch a daggum fish. Don't get so focused on that you forget to enjoy the journey of where you're at. And one of the fun things you're going to learn about fly fishing is there's always something new to learn in this sport. I'm actually starting to teach myself trout spay because there's a lot of bigger rivers here in Wyoming, and I think that trout spay would probably be a good way to approach my fall and winter fishing, and I think it'll be a lot of fun. That's always looked like an intriguing way to fish. So there's always something new to learn or to do in this sport. That's part of what makes it so much fun. Hopefully that answered your question. And if you need follow-ups, and this goes to anybody, if you need follow-ups or extra information on anything, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. That's what we're here for. That's why VFC exists. Don't forget to rate and subscribe to this show wherever you happen to be listening to it. That helps us out a ton. And if you have any questions at all that need to be answered, it can be something as simple like, why don't they make a power bait fly? Or what's the difference between a worm hook and a fly hook? It can be questions that simple. I want to answer them. I want to help. Make sure you send those on in to us. Always a link for that in the podcast description. And until next week, get out there, get on the water, catch some fish, have some fun, and tie lines.